Mark Winters stared at the email notification on his phone, his hands trembling. Termination of employment, read the subject line. Just 12 hours ago, he'd called in to stay home with his fever-stricken 8-year-old daughter. Now, at 7 p.m., as he sat beside Emma's hospital bed watching her finally sleep peacefully, his entire world had collapsed. What Mark couldn't possibly know was that in exactly 3 hours, he would be sitting across from Victoria Hayes, the CEO who had just fired him, and her father, one of the wealthiest men in America. And by midnight, all their lives would change forever. If you've ever felt that life can turn on a dime, that justice sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways, this story will resonate with your soul. Like, subscribe, and join me on this journey of redemption that proves sometimes the universe has plans far greater than our darkest moments. The pediatric ward of Memorial Hospital was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the polished floor. Mark Winters gently stroked his daughter Emma's forehead, relieved that her temperature had finally dropped below 102 degrees. The doctors had diagnosed her with pneumonia, far more serious than the simple fever he'd initially suspected when he'd called his boss that morning. "I'm sorry, Mr. Winters, but I need to be clear about company policy," Victoria Hayes had said coldly over the phone at 7 a.m. "We're presenting to the board today, and your section of the financial projections needs to be finalized. Can't your daughter's mother handle this?" Mark had swallowed hard before answering. "Emma's mother passed away 3 years ago, Ms. Hayes. I'm all she has. I've worked through the night to complete those projections, they're already in your inbox. I just need today to get Emma to the doctor. This is precisely why we have childcare services, Mr. Winters," Victoria had replied, her voice sharp with irritation. "I'll review what you've sent, but I expect you to understand there will be consequences for this absence." Mark hadn't expected those consequences to be immediate termination. After 5 years at Hayes Financial Solutions, where he'd consistently received excellent performance reviews and had never taken an unplanned day off, he was being discarded without warning or discussion. Now, staring at the termination email, Mark felt a cold knot of panic form in his stomach. His health insurance would end in 30 days. The mortgage payment was due next week. Emma's medication alone would cost hundreds without coverage. "Daddy?" Emma's small voice pulled him from his thoughts. Her face was pale against the white hospital pillow, her brown eyes, so like her mother's, looking up at him with trust he suddenly feared he couldn't live up to. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she whispered. "Can we go home soon?" "The doctor says maybe tomorrow," Mark answered, tucking her favorite stuffed rabbit closer to her side. "You just need to rest tonight." "But what about your big meeting?" Emma asked, her forehead creasing with worry. Even at 8, she understood responsibility. Mark had raised her to be considerate and thoughtful, perhaps too well. "Don't worry about that," he said gently. "You're what matters." As Emma drifted back to sleep, Mark stepped into the hallway to call his sister, Kate. He needed someone to stay with Emma while he cleared out his desk at the office. Company policy required terminated employees to remove their belongings within 24 hours. She did what? Kate's voice exploded through the phone when Mark explained the situation. "That heartless." "Kate, please," Mark interrupted. "I can't think about that right now. Can you come sit with Emma while I go to the office? I need to get my things and start looking for a new job immediately." "Of course," Kate said, her voice softening. "But Mark, you should fight this. It's wrongful termination. You have rights." "I don't have the energy or resources for a legal battle with Hayes Financial," Mark sighed. "Victoria's father is Gerald Hayes, the man owns half of downtown. I just need to focus on Emma and finding new work." An hour later, Kate arrived at the hospital, armed with Emma's favorite books and a determination to help her brother through this crisis. Mark kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead and headed to the office, his mind racing with calculations about how long his savings would last and which bills could be delayed. The Hayes Financial Solutions building stood 40 stories tall in the heart of the financial district, its glass exterior reflecting the city lights like a monument to wealth and power. At 9 p.m., the building was mostly empty, with only security guards and a few dedicated employees still at their desks. Mark nodded to the night security guard, who looked uncomfortable as he checked Mark's now deactivated badge. "I'm just here to clean out my desk, Joe," Mark explained quietly. "HR said I have until tomorrow." "Yeah, I got the email, Mr. Winters," Joe said, his eyes sympathetic. "I'm real sorry. For what it's worth, everyone likes you around here." "Thanks," Mark replied, stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the 32nd floor. The executive floor was dimly lit, with only emergency lights illuminating the path to his office. Mark had worked his way up to senior financial analyst over 5 dedicated years, often staying late and coming in weekends to ensure projects were perfect. His small office, with its view of the city park, had been a point of pride, evidence that his hard work was paying off. Now, as he began emptying his desk drawers into a cardboard box, each item felt like a small defeat. The framed photo of Emma at her last birthday. The coffee mug she had painted for him at a pottery class. The economics textbooks he'd used to teach himself advanced financial modeling after hours. "Working late, Winters?" The voice from the doorway made Mark freeze. Gerald Hayes, founder of Hayes Financial Solutions and father of Victoria, stood watching him, his imposing figure silhouetted against the hallway light. Mark straightened, instinctively smoothing his rumpled shirt. "Mr. Hayes. I'm just clearing out my desk." Gerald stepped into the office, his expression unreadable. At 72, he remained an intimidating presence, tall, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that had evaluated countless business deals. Though he had officially retired 5 years ago, handing the CEO position to his daughter, his influence remained palpable throughout the company. "Clearing out? Why?" Gerald asked, his voice betraying genuine confusion. Mark hesitated. Did Gerald not know about his termination? Was this some kind of test? "I received a termination notice this evening, sir," Mark finally said, deciding that honesty was his only option. "Effective immediately." Gerald's eyebrows rose. "On whose authority?" "Ms. Hayes, your daughter," Mark replied, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I missed an important board presentation today because my daughter is in the hospital with pneumonia." Something flickered across Gerald's face, surprise, followed quickly by what looked like anger. "Your daughter is in the hospital?" Gerald asked, his voice softening slightly. "Yes, sir. She's 8. It's just the 2 of us. Her mother passed away from cancer 3 years ago." Gerald was silent for a long moment, studying Mark with an intensity that made him want to look away. Finally, the older man spoke. "Pack up your things, Mr. Winters. Then I'd like you to join me for dinner." Mark blinked in confusion. "Sir? Dinner? At the Grayson? In 1 hour?" Gerald's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Before Mark could respond, Gerald turned and walked away, leaving him standing bewildered among the half-packed boxes of his career. The Grayson was the kind of restaurant where reservations were made months in advance, unless your name was Hayes. Mark felt painfully out of place as he entered the elegant dining room in his wrinkled shirt and the same suit he'd worn to work that morning. He'd called Kate to check on Emma, who was sleeping comfortably, before reluctantly making his way to the restaurant. The maitre d' led Mark to a private dining room in the back, where Gerald Hayes was already seated. To Mark's shock, Victoria Hayes sat beside her father, looking as surprised to see Mark as he was to see her. "Father, what is this about?" Victoria asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. At 35, she was known throughout the financial world for her brilliant mind and ruthless efficiency. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her tailored suit projected the power she wielded as CEO. "Sit down, Mr. Winters," Gerald said, ignoring his daughter's question. "Would you like a drink?" "No, thank you, sir," Mark replied, cautiously taking a seat across from them. "I need to get back to the hospital soon." "Of course," Gerald nodded. "How is your daughter?" "Improving, thank you," Mark said, increasingly confused by the situation. Victoria looked between them, her expression hardening. "Father, why is Mr. Winters here?" "He was terminated today for abandoning his responsibilities during a critical board presentation." Gerald turned to his daughter, his expression stern. "Victoria, did you fire this man because he took a day off to care for his seriously ill child?" Victoria's chin lifted defiantly. "I fired him because he failed to appear for a crucial presentation that he was responsible for preparing. The board was expecting his analysis." "Did he complete the analysis?" Gerald asked. Victoria hesitated. "Yes, he submitted it early this morning. But his absence was because his 8-year-old daughter has pneumonia and is in the hospital," Gerald finished for her. "And he's a single father because his wife died of cancer 3 years ago." The table fell silent. Mark shifted uncomfortably, feeling like a prop in some family drama he didn't understand. "Mr. Winters," Gerald said finally, turning back to Mark. "I apologize for my daughter's decision. It was made without my knowledge and does not reflect the values upon which I built Hayes Financial Solutions." "Father!" Victoria protested. Gerald held up a hand, silencing her. "Victoria, do you remember when you were 10 and had appendicitis?" Victoria's expression changed, confusion replacing anger. "Of course. I was in the middle of the Westridge acquisition, the deal that put our company on the map. Do you remember what I did when your mother called to say you were being rushed to surgery?" Victoria looked down at the table. "You left the meeting." "I walked out on the biggest deal of my career to be with my daughter," Gerald said firmly. "And when the Westridge executives complained, do you know what I told them?" Victoria remained silent. "I told them that any company that doesn't understand family emergencies isn't a company I want to do business with." Gerald's voice was quiet but forceful. They waited. The deal happened a week later. "And not once in the 40 years since have I regretted putting my child first." Mark watched as Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly. For a moment, she looked less like the intimidating CEO and more like a daughter being reminded of a lesson she'd forgotten. Gerald turned back to Mark. "Mr. Winters, I'd like to offer you your job back, with a promotion to Director of Financial Analysis and a significant raise." Mark's mouth fell open. "Sir, Additionally, Gerald continued, I'd like to implement a new family emergency leave policy at Hayes Financial, effective immediately. And I'd like you to help draft it, based on your experience." Victoria's eyes widened. "Father, you can't just—" "I built this company, Victoria," Gerald interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "And while you've done an admirable job as CEO in many respects, you seem to have forgotten the foundation upon which our success was built. It wasn't ruthless efficiency or perfect attendance. It was understanding that our employees are human beings with lives and families, and treating them accordingly." Mark sat in stunned silence, unable to process the rapid reversal of his fortunes. "Mr. Winters," Gerald said, "I understand if you need time to consider my offer. But I hope you'll accept. Hayes Financial needs people like you, not just for your financial acumen, but for your character and priorities." Mark took a deep breath, thinking of Emma in her hospital bed, of the mortgage payments and medical bills, of the career he'd built and lost in a single day. But he also thought about working for a company where he could be fired so easily, where family emergencies were seen as inconveniences rather than priorities. "Mr. Hayes," Mark said carefully, "I appreciate your offer. But I need to understand something first." He turned to Victoria. "Ms. Hayes, Do you agree with your father's assessment? Because if I come back, I'd be reporting to you, not him. The question hung in the air. Victoria looked at Mark, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. Not just as an employee who had missed a meeting, but as a father who had made the same choice her own father had made decades ago. The board was impressed with your analysis today, Mr. Winters, Victoria said finally, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. They specifically mentioned the thoroughness of your projections and the clarity of your recommendations. Your work spoke for you in your absence. She paused, seeming to struggle with her next words. I reacted hastily this morning. Perhaps I've been focusing too much on appearances and not enough on results and circumstances. It wasn't quite an apology, but Mark could see it was difficult for her to admit even this much. Gerald watched his daughter with a mixture of disappointment and hope. Victoria has been under tremendous pressure to prove herself worthy of the position I gave her, he said to Mark. Sometimes, in our effort to appear strong, we forget the strength that comes from compassion. Victoria's eyes flashed at her father's words, but she didn't contradict him. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and addressed Mark directly. Mr. Winters, if you choose to return to Hayes Financial, I can promise you that your position will be secure and your family priorities respected. And I would appreciate your input on the new family leave policy my father has suggested. Mark considered her words carefully. He thought about Emma, about the example he wanted to set for her, about the kind of world he wanted her to grow up in, one where compassion and understanding weren't seen as weaknesses. I'll consider your offer, he said finally. But right now, I need to get back to my daughter. Gerald nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Take all the time you need. Your position will be waiting. As Mark stood to leave, Gerald added, and Mr. Winters? Please send me the name of Emma's doctor. I'd like to make sure she's receiving the best care possible. Mark hesitated, then nodded his thanks, too overwhelmed to speak. 3 days later, Emma was released from the hospital, her condition significantly improved thanks to the specialist Gerald Hayes had arranged to consult on her case. Mark had spent those days considering the offer to return to Hayes Financial, weighing the practical benefits against his lingering concerns about the company culture. On the morning of Emma's release, as Mark was helping her pack her few belongings, there was a knock at the hospital room door. To his surprise, Victoria Hayes stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Ms. Hayes, Mark said, straightening in surprise. Mr. Winters, Victoria nodded, then turned her attention to Emma. And you must be Emma. I've heard a lot about you. Emma looked up curiously from the bed where she was carefully placing her stuffed rabbit in her backpack. Are you Daddy's boss? Victoria smiled slightly. I am. Or I hope to be again. She stepped into the room, holding a gift bag. I brought you something. I heard you like astronomy. Emma's eyes widened as she accepted the bag and pulled out a beautiful telescope. Wow. Thank you. My father gave me one just like it when I was about your age, Victoria said, her voice softening with the memory. He used to take me up to the roof of our building to look at the stars. Mark watched the interaction with surprise. This was a side of Victoria Hayes he'd never seen, or even imagined existed. Mr. Winters, could we speak privately for a moment? Victoria asked. Mark nodded, telling Emma he'd be just outside the door. In the hallway, Victoria's professional demeanor returned, but there was something different about her, a slight softening around the edges. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our dinner with my father, she began. About the kind of leader I want to be, and the kind of company Hayes Financial should be. Mark waited, sensing there was more. My father built the company on principles I've sometimes viewed as outdated.